Everyone, welcome to pH14, a very basic podcast brought to you by the UCSB Chemistry Club. I'm your host, Ben Cray, and today I have Professor Nadia Leonard with me. Professor Leonard is UCSB's newest assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. Her research interests include the use of CO2 to develop organic products, photoactive transition metal complexes, and chemical sensing. Professor Leonard, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm
really
excited to get to chat.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you. So usually we like to start with just a little icebreaker, just to get things rolling, not usually chemistry related. I noticed we're here in your wonderful office, beautiful setup. Do they like assign the offices to you, or do you choose one, or do they just show up and like, here's where you are?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I got very lucky to get into this into this office space simply because it's right next to my student offices and then also right next to my lab space. So I was assigned this. This was kind of like the open available space, and it all just worked out where I could move in. I did do a little bit of redecorating, so I painted the walls and then also got some new carpet in here. But it's been a really great transition into the department, and I'm just excited to get everything going.
Do you have any like loftier aspirations for decoration? So, not insulting you. I know you've only been here for so long, but it's a little barren.
It is a little barren, so I'm waiting on some of my office furniture to come in. So it's ordered, but not quite yet shipped and assembled. Once that happens, I'll get my books up. I'll have some nice things to put up on the wall, some decorations, and then hopefully make it like a little bit more homey, add like a plant or something. I think that'll really spruce it up.
I think the plants usually go over pretty well.
Yeah.
Have there been any offices on campus that you've kind of been inspired by that you've seen so far?
So Professor Wynn's office, I don't know if you've been in there or spoken with her much. So her office is beautiful. She has like just amazing artwork on the walls and like really cool like a accent wall that's like red. It's really eye-catching and really nice space.
Awesome. And we're kind of moving on a little fast, but I know you grew up in New Jersey. That's correct.
I did.
Where specifically in Jersey?
So I grew up in a very small town in North Jersey called Mount Arlington. It's like population of 5,000, I want to say. And so it's so small, it didn't have its own high school. The high school was in the town next door. But the thing that New Jersey is kind of known for is like the Jersey Shore. Also just like Route 95, which is like pretty much the thoroughfare that goes through the whole state and is really not nice to look at. But where I grew up is kind of like isolated away from that. It's a little bit quieter. There's a lot of farmland around. So it was pretty nice. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. What have been some of the major like cultural differences you've noticed since moving to California?
So this is going to out me a little bit. So driving mostly has been the biggest or hardest adjustment for me. New Jersey drivers also sometimes get called out for being really aggressive. So I realized when I moved out here from the East Coast that like it's not proper to like use your horn. And I do that a little bit too much, so I've had to kind of like readjust and realize that I shouldn't just like tap my horn to kind of like let people know that I'm coming.
Yeah, it's not considered like a reminder, it's considered like rude.
It's considered rude, and so I've been adjusting to that.
Which is weird because that's the whole point of the horn, right? It's supposed to like, don't hit me.
Yeah.
That's funny. All right, so I say we hop right into the meat of it. Let's talk about your research.
Yeah.
What would be like the, prospective student walks in, asks what you do here, like kind of elevator style pitch for what you do here at UCSB?
Yeah, absolutely. So my overarching interests really lie on trying to understand how to make use of non-covalent interactions and also traditional ligand tuning strategies to just improve catalysis, and then also related to trying to change physical properties, specifically photophysical properties of transition metal complexes. So like a lot of the inspiration from this comes from the fact that we know that both of those types of strategies are really well precedented in terms of like tuning the reactivity of transition metals. But it's really hard to decouple them from each other. So you can have non-covalent interactions, but most likely they will also have an electronic component in how they change the transition metal. So what I'm trying to do is figure out how to decouple those two effects and then use those as two separate strategies or two separate tuning handles to target things like, can we change the excited state lifetimes of emissive complexes? Can we use these two different strategies to change the thermodynamics to reduce CO2, for example? Or can we also use it as like a directing effect to try and get charged compounds into the coordination sphere of the transition metal to then react? So those are kind of the main things. Along with that, we can think about like specific applications towards like chemical sensing, right? So if you have a way of tuning not only the electronics of how something will bind, but also directing effects of having this secondary coordination sphere to get it near your metal center, that would be a really good way of sensing a chemical once it's in a reactive site.
So what inspired you to get into this work? I know you did a lot of previous work in some similar fields, and we'll get into that later in your grad school and your postdoc.
Yeah.
But what was just generally the inspiration for getting into this kind of work?
Yeah, so the inspiration, really does go all the way back to kind of first getting introduced in undergraduate to just transition metals and the really cool reactivity that they have, but specifically the fact that they have really interesting electronic structures. And that's kind of carried me all the way through up to now my independent career. But yeah, trying to broaden that out to applications towards like, can we target taking really available feedstocks and making them into value-added products from like really cheap materials? Or can we think about energy applications? Or can we think about it just in terms of like chemical sensors? So those are all like three main areas that are important in terms of trying to enhance efficiency.
So efficiency is kind of the name of the game.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think your work is part of like a larger trend of how chemistry is going, or do you think you're more like going against the flow of traffic? How would you describe like your work in relation to other stuff that's going on right now?
Yeah, so I think it definitely is like in the overall flow. So we have known for quite a while now that we need to think about sustainability as kind of like the crux of how we move forward in developing new chemical transformations. And so within that umbrella, understanding from like thermodynamic perspective, but then also just from atom economy, that's the way that we're going to be like move forward into new catalytic reactions. So yeah, it really is just like, I think as a field, we're moving towards taking this insight of how we can think about like new, unique tuning handles to like move towards more efficient reactivity.
And this is work that you started first in your grad school, or was that undergrad, or even earlier? What was like the first initial beginning of this? Yeah,
so I think it's kind of been in stages. So definitely in terms of just thinking about like how to change electronic structure and use that as a means to get to unique reactivity, that's grad school work. So yeah, in my grad school, my main focus and my main interest all lied on trying to understand first-row metals and how to utilize their unique electronic structures. So the reason why that's interesting is because they behave, or they can behave in a very different way than sort of the second and third-row metals. But because of that, they have other electron transfer events that are accessible to them. That makes it so that we can use them to access new chemistry utilizing that. So that's kind of the inspiration for like the electronic structure side of things, and then using ligands tuning strategies in order to rationally direct the way that goes. But then in terms of like broadening this out into trying to use secondary coordination sphere interactions, it's like the secondary tuning handle, that really comes from inspiration from my postdoc. So it's these two effects together, and then trying to relate that towards energy applications, or just like these big problems in chemistry that we're trying to solve.
So what inspired you initially to get into like higher level research?
Yeah.
Because you obviously did your undergrad in, was it chemistry or biochemistry? Like what was the specific field?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad in chemistry. I actually started as a chemical engineering major in undergrad and made it through like the first year sequence of the engineering courses and then decided that it wasn't for me and that I wanted to be in a lab space, like actually making things heavy emphasis on synthesis. And then that kind of got me into looking for research opportunities in a research lab as an undergrad.
So you would say you prefer the hands-on approach to lab work more so than like the desk work, the data, the computer, the math?
Yeah. For me, I think I've always been more interested on like the synthesis side of things. So definitely my strengths, I think, are in inorganic synthesis specifically. So like my lab is an inorganic synthesis lab. And so we pull a lot of those synthetic techniques using like air-free manipulations, Schlenk lines, glove boxes, to make these really reactive transition metal complexes.
So you like a little bit of the danger.
I
think that's what draws a lot of people to chemistry at first, is that it is dangerous and you can hurt yourself in theory.
Yeah, but as long as you do everything like by the book and with proper safety protocols, it's totally fine.
Yeah. So when did you transition your mindset from I really like working in the lab specifically to not only do I want to do lab work, but I want to lead lab work, I want to help other people do lab work, and I want to do like to be a professor essentially, do lectures and teach classes and have office hours and everything that comes with that?
Yeah. So I've always been really fascinated by just the ability of being able to like train people, and that comes a lot from the fact that I've been really lucky in having very strong mentors. But I think it's just so interesting to see how you can basically propagate the knowledge out just by not only training your students, but also formulating these ideas of like, okay, what is an interesting research target? How can we put it into the context of like an important problem? What are the challenges and why hasn't it been solved yet? Like, where are the gaps? And then basically trying to formulate that idea into like an actual practical thing that we can study in the lab and then see how that takes off. I think the other thing that's really interesting is, and that drew me to this job, is the fact that you can have like a first research question and direction, but then once you actually start digging into it and actually start to get the experiments going, you usually find like 10 other pathways that open up into interesting directions. And it's usually the things that you're not expecting that end up being the most interesting projects. So I think the ability to kind of like see that, and then also have my students kind of like figure out the things that they're the most interested in and then kind of follow down that rabbit hole, hopefully to something interesting at the end, is like really exciting. Yeah,
I love that. So as I mentioned in the intro, you are our newest assistant professor here at UCSB in the chemistry and biochemistry department. You started this year, 2023, is that right?
That's right.
Well, your first day was when?
My first day was July 13th.
And how's it been so far, these first 2 months pretty much?
It's been really good. So it's been definitely just a transition from postdoc into like the faculty position, right? Because postdoc is still like primarily a research position. So I was up in the lab doing experiments. And so now I'm still up in the lab doing experiments, but then there's the other side of things that's just, planning out on the big picture of like where the lab directions are going, mentoring students, starting to think about writing grants, hopefully in the not too far away future, thinking about writing the first publications. So it's definitely right now, it has been like a good easing in point where I'm like still able to like be in the lab, but eventually I know I'll transition totally to just like working with students more on like getting them to be the ones to like, take total independence and be the ones running all of the experiments in the lab.
And speaking of starting a lab, specifically with recruiting for students, what are some things that you look for in prospective students to be working in your lab?
So mostly just like enthusiasm and interest. So specifically interest in metal complexes is a plus, but I definitely don't necessarily expect people to come in knowing everything about how to work in a glove box or everything about like some of the specific characterization techniques that we'll be using, especially for these like mostly paramagnetic complexes that we're going to be synthesizing. So it's mostly just enthusiasm and the dedication to know that starting a new lab is a very different experience from like a lot of other lab experiences. So it's kind of cool because students that are coming in are basically seeing everything built from the ground up. So it's as much as like, okay, we need to like write SOPs for how we do all of our procedures in the lab, from everything from like how we're washing glassware to how we're bringing things into the glove boxes. We're also just figuring out what our, group meetings are going to look like. So we have LIP meetings that we just did our first one last week. We're also going to be doing like group meetings so everybody can see what everyone else is doing in the lab. It's really a unique, I think, opportunity to kind of see what it looks like, just like how everything is very flexible right now because we're just like figuring it out as we go. Yeah.
How big is your personnel list so far?
So right now I have 6 undergraduates. 4 of them have already started and 2 more will be starting with the fall quarter very shortly. And 1 graduate student who's joining also with the fall quarter.
Awesome. Yeah, that's pretty quick.
Yeah.
Pretty quick turnover. Speaking from my own personal experience, as I mentioned to you earlier, I work with the Carlini group. For listeners, that's someone we've already interviewed for episode 2. And that's also a group that's been starting pretty much from the ground up. I think we recently passed a year of the group being on campus. And a big part of that has been transitioning the lab. I think it's different experiences because we inherited an already fully utilized lab from Stuckey. So that's been an insane experience. Like we have this massive graveyard of stuff and like spending hours and hours and hours and days and days and days just going through and inventorying old stuff and coming across things that are probably 30 plus year old chemicals that just shatter as soon as you touch them and all sorts of things. I mean, I my initial start in that lab was not as a researcher. I was starting out as pretty much like an inventory and dishwasher because there was no open positions. And so I just volunteered pretty much to clean stuff. And I feel like that's an experience you can really only get with a new group.
Definitely.
And there's something totally different between something that's right at the ground floor. It's kind of like like the difference between like a startup and then like some like Fortune 500 company.
Right.
There's a totally distinct level of intimacy with what is being produced.
That's totally true. And so I mean, we're going through something similar, but a little bit different. So we're moving into a lab space that was already utilized, but the good thing for me is that it's very similar applications based of like the prior occupants to me. So things like glove boxes. So right now it's a matter of like cleaning those out and getting them back up to like running to the purposes that we'll be using them for. It's definitely a lot of work, a lot of just troubleshooting equipment, which is not something that you would always be exposed to, especially as an undergrad. I think
definitely,
just to see like, okay, if we look at the glove box, if we look at the actual like mechanics of how it works in the circulation system, there's a leak somewhere, so we got to troubleshoot where that leak is. And that's usually something that maybe you'll see in grad school. Hopefully you'll see in grad school, but as an undergrad, that's a little bit different. It's kind of cool.
Nothing will teach you how to use a schlank line more than having to build it
exactly
yourself.
Right.
Which is something that is not often available to other groups because they already are there. The infrastructure already exists.
Right.
digging a little deeper into your relationship with your undergrads. When I had a conversation yesterday with Professor Hawker and Professor Reed de Alanis, both of which you were involved with Bio-Pacific MIP, one of the things they were most adamant about in terms of sort of the loftier ambitions of that organization was reframing, reworking, or in their words, modernizing the relationship between a PI and an undergraduate, or just generally these the hierarchy of academic science. As a young professor who's just now getting their start as a PI, what are your thoughts on how you want to make your relationship with your undergrads and your grad students to be?
Yeah. So one of the advantages, I think, of definitely the first class of students that I will be working with is the fact that I, right now, have the time to be in lab. So it is my intention, and this is actually happening with my, undergrads who have already started, is I'm the one showing them how to do everything in lab, right? So that's very different. I think that's a very different experience depending on kind of like how busy your professor is, right? Because somebody who's definitely a lot more established has a lot of things on their plate. So they're very busy. So basically it's really important to me for this first class to kind of like get to see me doing things in the lab, but then also get to learn from me like specific techniques, specific like one-on-one mentorship, and how, after you set it up, this is how you like analyze your data, and this is how we'll talk through it, and then also just like feedback on presentations and everything. And I think that not only is good for me to like, get that experience and like one-on-one building relationship with my students so that I can actually, know where they need more help, where they want to go, where, their goals are for after they finish doing research with me, but also for them to be able to walk away from this and say like, these are all the things I learned. I basically got to see what it looks like to, almost be a grad student. For my grad students, they will, basically see like, this is what it looks like to set up a lab if I ever want to do that, later in my career. I think laying that groundwork and like developing those relationships with the first class is really important. And then eventually the goal is that first class will be able to take all of that knowledge, and then they'll be able to train, the subsequent classes that come in later.
Yeah, so you're really setting the foundation for not only how your lab will be run under you, but then also to how hopefully their labs will be run under them.
Yeah.
Is that scary? Is that exciting?
I think definitely a mixture of both. Yeah, definitely a mixture of both, but mostly exciting. Because, I think the most important thing in academia, honestly, is just like this transference of knowledge, right? Because you spend so much time dedicated to like learning everything you can about, a specific research question or a specific area, and being able to relate that information to like, a broad audience of people afterwards is like probably the biggest gain that you can get. So that transfer of knowledge is really important.
You mentioned earlier about mentors. You've had a lot of mentors, whether it's Professor Jenny Yang at UCI or any of the people you worked with at Brown or at Princeton, or even just here, or people you met at conferences. What have been some of the best advice you've gotten from any number of your mentors? It could be anybody.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me think about this. So we'll start like most recent mentor to now. So I think for my postdoc mentor, Jenny, so she really helped me think about, when like writing proposals, how to frame the question in a way that's like really accessible to people. So I think this has been really helpful for me in definitely formulating research questions for like this independent career, but also thinking about like where it could go later and writing grants. Is really the main three questions you have to think about is, what is the problem, where is the existing gap, and then who cares about it, right? So if you can answer those three questions like with the least amount of jargon, then you're doing pretty good, because you're going to get people excited about what you're doing and provide the context of why it's important. For Paul, my grad school advisor, so I really appreciated just the way, so I think they're all like pretty similar advice, honestly. Just the way that you formulate and think about like answering questions. One thing that we would always do in like grad school presentations, whether it be like group meeting or presenting at a conference, is to always start it with like a big picture slide. So it's like zoomed out as much as you possibly can, like why is this problem important? And then if you provide the big picture, then you can always like narrow down from there into like what you're doing and how you're solving that big picture slide. But it provides that context of like why people should be interested. My undergraduate advisor was really the person who like got me in the lab. So I think the best advice was that just like don't just dive in just completely. Just start. Just get started and dive in completely. And it's okay to make mistakes. It's probably also really high up there in terms of like good advice. Because you learn from mistakes and knowing where you went wrong, how you can adjust from there, and then make it better in the next iteration is probably the best way to learn and just get better.
I took a material arts class this most recent quarter, and one of the best pieces of advice I got from that was if you don't know what to make, just make. So even if you don't really have any direction with your research, well, you're lucky in research that there's other people around you that can, you can bounce things off of. That's why group meetings are so important. But even if you don't know, just trying things, working through things, considering outside options is always something that's going to be super duper valuable. I feel like that's something that you, so far, have kind of expressed to me is something that you're trying to show to your students, which I love.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would much rather you make a mistake, tell me about it, we'll think through it together, and then to be like, oh my goodness, this is terrible, and then just be completely discouraged.
So kind of going through your background, you were undergraduate at Brown, you were PhD at Princeton. Those two names are obviously associated under one umbrella, which is Ivy League. And then you switch over, now it's UCI and UCSB, so once again, another umbrella. Obviously, some pretty significant cultural differences between those two layers of institution. What would you say was like the biggest, I guess, culture shock coming from Ivy to UC system?
Definitely just the size. So my undergrad campus itself was really small. And so like just walking around campus, you recognize everybody. So I like knew everybody, or at least recognized their faces from my like incoming class. And even going from Brown to Princeton, that was like a size jump. So Princeton's campus was a lot bigger. But then UCI is just like
it's huge.
So much bigger. So that was the biggest shock. I think also, I guess the amount of face time that you can actually have between your professors and then students was different. So because of the size of Brown and Princeton, you had a little bit more option for FaceTime. But I think the caveat to that is there's actually, it seems to me, more research opportunities at the UC system. So I've definitely seen just like more undergraduates getting into labs, doing research. The graduate programs obviously are a lot bigger also. So in that way, there seem to be like more avenues to actually get in and do like really cool things in lab.
That's great. I love that. We have a question here, and it was actually the way it's written is rather funny. And it wasn't written by me; it was written by Nathan. So I'm going to read it word for word.
Okay.
at a trivia night recently, you explained to two of our officers, specifically Nathan and Liad, who people will know from previous episodes, he also put in parentheses, shout out, that one thing the scientific community needs to work on is communication. How do you think the scientific world can better their communication skills to a broader audience?
Yes. Okay. So this is something that I'm still working on because I think it is just going to be like a continuous thing to learn and grow and get better at. Mm-hmm. If we think about it, it's really there can be a huge divide between kind of talking about chemistry in terms of like what we actually do on a day-to-day basis, and then the context of like what we're trying to do or what the applications we're trying to actually pursue. In terms of like chemical knowledge or like getting good at like scientific communication, I think the best ways of doing that is just to try and like talk about your research to as many people from as many different backgrounds and kind of points of view as possible, right? So good opportunities for that is to just like come up with an elevator pitch that you can throw around to tell your family, to tell people that you like bump into on the street, to tell people that you just like meet at conferences and stuff. And I think from that you can actually get much better at kind of like finding the parts that really convey like why you're interested in what you're interested into a way that's like a good absorbable message. Yeah.
I think one of my favorite things about the scientific community at large is that explaining why your work is important and what your work is tends to be almost equally as important as the work itself.
Yeah.
Which is why science communication is such a huge industry, whether it's content creation or obviously being a professor, which is just the most direct form of science communication. And so what that lends itself to is that there are many different ways of approaching science. You don't just have to be in industry. You don't just have to be a professor. You don't just have to be in academia. You can do a whole lot of things. And that's something that you've talked about prior. You've groaned about this earlier, but there's a certain video that you made. It's on Vimeo, not YouTube for some reason. You talked about different avenues PhD chemists can go through that are separate from traditional industry or academia. I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit more on that and like maybe what those avenues are.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's definitely in classes in a university setting, it can seem like there's only like one set path or maybe two set paths you can go on coming from like a chemistry background. It looks like bachelor's degree, you go to grad school, and then from grad school you either go into industry, maybe working at a pharmaceutical company or like a big chemical company, or you go into academia. But within that, there's so many different pathways that are possible. So science communication. So one of my really good friends from grad school actually is currently working at the State Department. And it's because she was really interested in science policy at the end of her PhD and decided that she wanted to work in the DC area to help get policy changes towards moving things towards more environmentally sustainable practices and get that in like at the government level. So that requires being really good at science communication. There's also, it's possible to go into other areas that are related to industry, but maybe, instead of working for like a big company, you're working for a startup. So then that's more like building a small business that requires all of your chemical knowledge that you've accumulated up until this point, but then also thinking about like managing, thinking about getting investors, being able to pitch what your research idea is to a wide variety of different people in order to get interest and then get people who want to be hired on or, want to fund you. There's just like so many different avenues, and I think it's really important to be able to like highlight all of those, especially to students as they're like going through their own career and professional development, in order to show that there's so many different views and so many different ways it can look like to be a chemist.
Mm-hmm. So considering all these views and different avenues, were there any that you ever seriously saw yourself in that aren't academia? Anything that you maybe dip your toes in and just realize the water was too hot, or I guess why are you here instead of there is sort of what I'm getting at.
Yes, so I definitely considered going to work for industry, like very seriously. But the thing that I realized, and I think the reason why I'm here instead of there, is because there's a lot of overlap and similarities between the two. So like the main things that I'm most passionate about is that mentorship component, the idea of trying to come up with, interesting research projects and basically like directing a lab. Those are similar, and there's a lot of overlap between, roles that are almost identical across all of these different industries. So for me, this ended up being the best fit where it kind of gave me the opportunity to work in all of those things that I'm passionate about, but then also the other side of it, which is teaching. Teaching on a class level, this ability to be able to work with students kind of all along their educational journey. The idea of being able to develop a course about something that I'm really interested in. I would like to take that forward and just establish not only the research side of things, but also build as a teacher and a professor as well.
I love that. That's great. So you mentioned that you had aspirations of maybe developing your own courses. Is there a particular field of study or subjects that you'd want to build a lecture out of, or is there classes that already exist you maybe would want to take over? Are you teaching this upcoming quarter? What are you teaching?
Yeah, so we'll start with what I'm teaching. So this upcoming fall quarter, I'm teaching Chem 293, which is the graduate level faculty seminars. So it's really cool because I get to meet the incoming graduate class and have a lot of FaceTime with them. But then also the purpose of this course is to be a overview of all of the research that's happening in the department. So there will be faculty guests that come in and give a short presentation about what their lab is like and what open projects they have. And it'll be an opportunity for the first years to ask questions about that, but also for me to kind of field those questions, ask questions of my own, and just really be this mediator to kind of give this overview of all of the cool things that are happening in the department already. So what I would like to teach, so I'm thinking about developing a special topics course that I would like to be cross-listed for both undergraduates and graduate students that's based on sustainability, sustainable practices in chemistry, but really has a focus on taking case studies out of the literature, even popular science publications, and as a project we'll basically learn what a life cycle assessment is, and then the end goal of the course will be to have each student do a life cycle assessment, some chemical process of their choice, and go through how is it done now? Is it done in a sustainable way? Are there people working on it to make it a more sustainable process? How close are we to doing that? And basically just trying to dig into, understanding chemical processes as they exist and whether or not we can make them better.
So by life cycle, do you mean in terms of the waste management process of it, or just the entire inception to, I guess, deletion, so to speak, of what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so life cycle in terms of waste management, that's a huge part of it, but also what is the energy input that we're currently putting in? What's like a techno-economic analysis of it? Are there people interested in trying to change it, or is that just economically a no-go situation? And of course, like depending on how large of a process, if we're talking about industrial processes, the techno-economics of it are actually really important. Right?
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, just like looking at it at different scales, obviously, but trying to get an understanding of like how one would even start to do this type of analysis. And then where it actually comes in that we can start to try and identify places where this portion of this process could be like way more sustainable. How would we think about doing that? Is anybody already trying to do that? Yeah.
I think that's great. I want to transition now to a section of the podcast we like to call Blue Booked. Basically, what Blue Booked is a test for you.
Okay.
So for previous episodes, what we've done is we've taken previous exam questions written by professors and then given them back to see if they still know how to answer them or if they're hypocrites. You do not have exam questions yet because you have not taught any classes yet.
Not yet.
So instead what we have is something significantly more difficult.
Okay.
So here's your sheet. We'll put this up on the screen.
Yeah.
The crying emojis were Nathan's addition. So it's 3 questions. Basically what it is we want you to know if you can see these and figure out either what the catalyst was or what the reagents were or what the reaction conditions were.
Okay.
So these 2 are from the internet.
Yeah.
This one you might recognize
Yeah.
as being from one of your papers you were first author on. So hopefully you know this one.
Okay.
Otherwise it'll be extremely embarrassing.
Yeah.
I'm just joking, but I have the answer key, which is what I was folding up earlier. Is why I didn't give you this paper.
Okay.
But I want to see if you can kind of walk your way through this.
Cool. So should I read these out or?
They'll be up on the screen, but yeah, if you want to work through your process out loud, yeah.
Okay, cool. So for this top one, we have a nice substituted indene plus HB pen, and the question is what metal is needed for this reaction. So it's cobalt. This is one of my favorite papers from grad school, actually. These products are really cool and really, valuable synthons. Making these diastereoselectively was pretty cool, and I learned a lot from this project. But yeah, the answer is cobalt.
You are correct. You are correct. Very nice. What about cobalt makes it uniquely qualified for this particular reaction?
Yeah, so for this particular reaction, the thing that was really the most exciting about this project was the fact that we were able to use chain walking. So cobalt isn't the only metal that can do chain walking, but the specific terpyridine cobalt catalyst that's used in this reaction is really, really efficient at doing chain walking, specifically for these cyclic type of substrates. So the fact that it was able to not only do the chain walking, but do it regio and stereoselectively was like pretty cool. So I tried other metals, and they just didn't have the same specificity. So cobalt was really the winner here.
And this came from the work you mentioned earlier where you were working with first row metals, correct? Yeah. And I realized you probably already knew this, but I realized I made a mistake for the audience. I said the first 2 were from the internet. Clearly that's wrong. You worked on both of them. You've worked on all of these. Is that correct?
Yeah. Right.
So I'll amend that mistake. These are all stuff that she's worked on. So the second one here, I'll see if we can get this one.
Okay. So what molecules are needed for the synthesis of these complexes? Okay. So where should I start? I guess.
I guess there's 2 steps to this reaction.
Yeah.
So maybe start with the first one, maybe just from here to here, and then see if you can get the second to the third going.
Okay. So for this first compound, I believe I started with the iridium cod or iridium COE complex, and then added methyl iodide to get to the methyl iodo complex.
So I don't know exactly how to say this one. I think it's a dimethyl magnesium.
Oh.
CH32 and then magnesium.
Okay. So I started with the Grignard.
No, I think that's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're correct. I'm sorry, I wasn't sure that was a question or
Okay,
not.
okay.
Yes, yeah, you're correct.
Okay, okay. Interesting. Okay.
Was this maybe an earlier version of this reaction
It
that
might have
maybe
been
had
an
been
earlier
optimized?
version.
Because you have the iodide here,
Yeah.
and then it gets replaced with the Grignard reagent, yeah.
Okay. So then I'm wrong. That's really embarrassing.
No, that's not embarrassing. If you think that is embarrassing, then your standards are extremely high for yourself. Because I see this and I do not recognize most anything.
Okay. Okay, cool. And then, to get to the dihydrate, I think I just added hydrogen gas to the dimethyl.
You are correct.
Yeah.
Hydrogen gas.
Yeah.
This third one here, for those of you looking on the screen, looks absolutely ridiculous. There's some sort of bright red dyed powder and a bunch of big reagents and many sad crying emojis. If you can walk us through.
Yeah. Okay. So for this first one, pretty sure that is just ammonium hydroxide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we get the nice cyclization to get to the terpyridine, the aryl substituted terpyridine ligand, and then complexation to cobalt 2 acetate. And then, this complex actually is similar to the one that's used in the first one that we talked about. So it's the same terpyridine cobalt. That's the catalyst.
Excellent. You performed extremely well. You passed with flying colors. A+. I'm extremely impressed. It's so funny that it should be obvious that you can look at stuff you've done and know what you did.
Yeah.
But
well,
just
hopefully.
looking at it on paper, and then just being able to pull it from the magic hat is so impressive, honestly. It's something I've noticed with previous professors we've tested. We did Professor Green, and it was from his biochemistry class. And it wasn't even anything on the paper. It was some open-ended question about the number of ATPs for some system. Mm-hmm. And he got it wrong, but he was one off. The answer was 3 and he said 4. But just hearing the cogs turn was crazy, very illuminating. Because the reason we like this, and the reason we invented this segment, is that you don't often get to see professors thinking about a question. Mm-hmm. That's why I like it. As silly as it is, obviously it is silly.
It's a good turning of the tables.
A little bit of a turn of the table,
go back to being the students for a little bit, which is good.
even if I literally have the answer in front of me, I still don't even know if it's correct or not. I do know what a Grignard agent is. I promise, I do. I just forgot. It is impressive and interesting to me to see the process, to see how professors think, because usually, obviously, when you're presenting a lecture or you're giving out an exam, you already know the answers, because why wouldn't you? It'd be weird if you didn't. So seeing the process we go through is really cool, and I love it. I have a few more questions for you, just a little more general questions. In terms of getting involved with research, specifically as an undergrad, how would you recommend people go through that process? Should you just cold email? As a professor, how would you like to be approached by students?
Yeah. So a cold email is totally fine, but I can understand how that is a bit of an intimidating ask, right? Mm-hmm. Especially, I know you all are very conscious of the fact that, that professors are busy, mm-hmm. but honestly, the chance for us to get to talk about our research and the things that we're interested in is amazing.
Of course.
So cold email is totally fine. The other way that you can do it is there's a lot of actual dedicated programs that are available for getting undergraduates into research. Mm-hmm. So things of R&D REUs that happen over the summertime. I know UCSB has a couple of programs as well that they host here on campus. So those would be avenues to do it. But if you're ever just curious or wanted to chat to somebody about it, ask your professors in classes. Pull them aside at the end of class and just be like, hey, I'm interested in getting some research experience in the lab. Do you have any advice for me? Do you have any suggestions? Do you know anybody that's, looking for undergraduate researchers right now? And that'll go a long way of, kind of word of mouth to get you in touch with the right people. So the other thing I want to say is make use of, any student clubs that you might know of also that are specifically are run by grad students. Because grad students kind of have the best pulse on what's happening in the department. I know that there's a new graduate student group that's specifically trying to recruit undergraduate students to give them just exposure to what it looks like to work in a lab. So not exactly like doing undergraduate research, but just like, this is what a chemistry lab looks like. You can talk to a graduate student, they will be your mentor, and you will shadow them for a quarter and just see what it looks like in a lab. And so that's called the grad prep program, and I, as well as Dr. Anika, are the faculty mentors for that program, and so that'll be starting at some point over this next year, where we'll be looking for interested undergraduates to just kind of like get them that exposure of like, this is what it looks like in a lab, and here's a graduate student who can kind of walk you through what they do on a day-to-day basis.
I think that's an amazing program to have, because I think from my personal experience, it was sort of expected that it would be this kind of trial by fire once you got into it, which obviously does not have to be the case. So getting undergrads and grad students in contact is awesome. ChemPD is also a thing on campus that's mostly for grad students, but they do run a lot of events that are meant to cater to undergrads that are thinking about grad school. So it'd also be a great resource. You mentioned REUs. That's something that I talked about yesterday with Hawker and Reed DeAlanis. They talked about REUs, and those are a great thing. Did you do any REUs when you were an undergrad?
I did, yeah. I did one REU the summer before my senior year as an undergrad. That was phenomenal. It was a really great experience. So at that point, I had been doing undergraduate research at Brown for, I guess, 2 years. Wow, yeah, okay. So I started undergraduate research sometime in my second year, and then, the summer before my senior year, I went to a different institution and did an REU. And so the great thing about doing an REU at any point in your undergraduate career is just the ability to go somewhere else and see how things are done there, right? A change of perspective, exactly. Because, chemistry projects change, definitely, but then also just like being in an environment to see how the same things that you've already learned are just done in a different environment is like awesome learning experience, because you just get to kind of see just the breadth of how everything can be done and how things are, might be slightly different, but you still recognize it's these same tools that you've already learned, you're just applying them in a new environment.
That reminds me of a question I had that I never got a chance to ask anybody before, which is that in your early career, it is a lot of frequent location change.
Yeah.
So it's your undergrad, typically your grad is somewhere else, typically your postdoc is somewhere else entirely. It's pretty rare that you stay at the same spot for more than a couple years. And then obviously assuming you were to be a professor, whatever your faculty position, your first one is probably not where you had your postdoc, and it is not exactly a done deal that you will stay where you started.
Right.
So there's a lot of movement.
Yeah.
And as you said, one of the good things about REUs, you get a chance to see how different labs are run. But the flip side of that is that you don't often get the chance to fully assimilate into a particular lab culture before you then have to shift over to something entirely. So what would be some pieces of advice you would give to people that are maybe on the horizon of moving into the next stage of another program and how to kind of approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the moving can be really challenging, right? Because transitions are a lot of work and they require, a big amount of energy, especially in the outset of just like getting accustomed to your new environment. But I think the thing that is kind of the best advice in approaching that is you, at each stage, you are able to take everything that you've already learned, and you might not know like the fastest way to do the thing that you want to do in a new environment, but you have the basis already. You have the basis of like, the right questions to ask, and you can figure out who you need to talk to help you get to the places or like help you do the things that you need to do. So an example of this would be when I started my postdoc. Basically, I went from, at the end of my graduate career, knowing how to do everything the most efficient that I had ever been up until that point.
Yeah.
I knew how to run 10 reactions a day, work them all up, get all of the characterization data, and it was just super streamlined. And in starting the postdoc, I went from still having all of that knowledge that I had built up over my PhD, and holding that, but then just on the practical side of things, not knowing where to do those things. So that transition is really slow, but I think the best thing is to just be patient, because eventually you'll get there, and the amount of time it takes to ramp up to that same level that you were at in your last place, it gets shorter and shorter with each transition, because you just get more efficient at it, and then you also understand how to get the tools that are necessary in order to get you back up to that level in a new environment.
I think that's really insightful. I want to leave us off here with one last question, which would be more broadly in terms of your lab. What would be the number one takeaway that you would want your students to have after they've moved on from working with you?
Yeah. So my goal for all of my students is they'll be able to come out of the lab being able to identify important research problems and then convince people why they're important, and then be independent in their strategies of trying to solve those problems. So it really just comes back to being able to take the fundamentals and broaden it out to explain it to anyone. But also just along with that, we're using specific techniques, right? So they should really just take ownership of their projects and become experts in their project. And that means learning all types of characterization techniques, along with synthesis, along with the analytical side of things. So they'll come out of it being expert inorganic chemists, expert organic chemists, expert physical chemists in terms of identifying electronic structure and looking at looking at the UV visible properties, and then also expert electrochemists analyzing redox processes. So yeah, it's really getting a broad range of skills coming out of it.
Well, I really want to thank you for being on the show today. Professor Nadia Leonard, you are clearly very passionate about what you do for your own work, for your students' work, for everything you've done in the past and everything for now. I really appreciate you coming on the show. You were awesome. I had a lot of fun talking with you. You're also clearly very intelligent when it comes to answering hard questions on the fly.
One of them tripped me up.
One of them tripped you up, but I couldn't even answer the question whether you were wrong or right. So clearly that goes both ways. Is there any last minute remarks you maybe want to make? Any shout outs, anything like that?
I will shout out to my current lab members. Hopefully they will listen to this and not make too much fun of me. But yeah, this was really awesome. Thank you so much. This was really, really cool, and you're a great host, so I really enjoyed this.
Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, pH14, a very basic podcast, once again brought to you by the UCSB Chemistry Club. We thank you all for listening. We thank Professor Nadia Leonard, and we hope you all have a great day. Thank you.